using EdTPA as a tool for analyzing what was happening in the school. So at any time in this presentation, because we're a small group, if you have questions or burning questions, I'd really like to know what they are. And I think what I might like to start with is to know if there are any burning questions so that we can put them on the slides here. Okay? So. Burning questions. Our burning questions. Any that you can think of right now? Anybody's burning question, and what is it? Is that a burning question? No, that's a good thing. Okay. I understand that it's been mandated in Georgia to begin rolling out right now a percentage. Is that true, or is it complete?
It's everyone, fall 2015.
Okay, so by fall 2015, how do we ensure that our students are successful? Would that be a burning question? I mean, that's kind of our goal, right? That we want to be sure that everyone's making it. Anybody else?
Maybe how do we prepare them, make sure they're successful without having it overtake and become our curriculum? We don't want our program to be EdTPA. Well, at the same time, we want them to be.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's something we have kind of grappled with in North Carolina. And my view of it is it's just a tool, and it really it is informing what we do in our classroom, and it may be changing some of the pieces we do in our classroom. But for the most part, everything we have been doing is still being done. And in some sense, it may be being done a little more intentional or a little differently. And in some ways, I think almost better in some ideas. Good question. Ann?
How do we inform, integrate, involve our arts and sciences colleagues?
And I think another question is to how do we inform, integrate, and involve our K-12 partners?
Yeah,
so our colleagues.
I haven't gotten.
And
I haven't gotten.
Yeah.
Well, yes, and
partners.
how should they? I actually had a student who seemed to think that her host teacher knew about EdTPA, but then when I talked to teachers, I talked to another teacher, she was like, no, I don't know what EdTPA is. So it was, so I don't know.
And one of the ways we had, and I'll address this just as a little piece, our arts and science faculty who actually teach our licensure candidates, it will be very helpful if they understand what is happening and what is this final product that our candidates have to do, and how are they using reflection, and how are they using planning, and what are some of these terms that, say, in your educational psychology class, you may be talking about characteristics of young adolescents. Well, maybe we can now use a word called the assets that come into your classroom, whether the students' personal assets, their cultural, their community, their intellectual assets. And so one of the things that we found with EdTPA had to do with the language, was what was more challenging to us than the actual creating a product. Because I know in your teacher work sample, for instance, students have to plan, they have to teach, and they have to assess student learning. Well, it's not any different in EdTPA, and my advice, my simple advice would be that teacher work sample is awesome, and it's huge. And EdTPA would be, if you considered that 10-day lesson plan or unit plan that those students have to do, imagine that they would choose a segment of that, say 3 days out of that they really want to showcase as a evidence or a portfolio evidence. So it's not that it's going to be replacing, like you were talking about, Stacy, it's not going to be replacing what is happening in your classroom. It's a tool, and if we look at it, that best practice is that our candidates must know how to work with young adolescents. They have to know young adolescent characteristics. They need to know instructional strategies that are considered best practice and research-based. They have to know how to be able to assess candidates or student learning in multiple ways. But for this piece, it's just it's capturing perhaps the best of that unit, but it almost doesn't even have to be the actual best of that unit. It's just showing the different pieces. Can I plan for differentiation in my classroom? Am I getting my students to think deeper? And are they engaging in what's happening in the classroom? And how is my rapport with my students being displayed in there? And so then if you think about the assessment, so there's 3 parts to EdTPA. One is planning, and it's not any different than what you plan. And I'm an evaluator for the EdTPA, so I've gotten to see some of the actual products people have. And in no way does EdTPA say you have to use this lesson plan format, or that you have to have a 9-point or a 5E lesson plan. It just says you have to have plans. And in those plans, there has to be evidence of that you're starting at one point, and it's kind of like there's a thread running through, just like we want our students to do. The biggest difference I've seen in it is that while you have the content that students have done, and I teach math methods, but I also teach the science methods, and this semester I'm teaching world language methods, but it's like, so what is the content that you, what process and process skills are students learning? And are you being intentional as a teacher to not only teach the content, but teaching the process? And that there are products involved. And so when you think about best practice and how you're teaching your students how to write lesson plans and unit plans, I would imagine that you've got the content information down, and that students use instructional strategies and reading strategies all the way through. One of the things I saw is that I wasn't making my students be intentional about teaching problem solving and saying, that for this lesson, it's all about describing. And that's our language function. That's what it's all about, describing. So this week, while we're dealing with imagery and what imagery makes or takes to do, I'm saying describing is our language function. So I want you to be able to use this content to be able to describe and say that my product happens to be digital storytelling. And so you're going to learn how to do a digital story, and you're going to create one as your product. So it's that whole idea of content, process, and product, which is no different to me than what we're teaching our students anyway. And the biggest difference in the assessment piece, the thing that struck me about EdTPA is that it's not asking us necessarily for pre, during, and post-assessment, but I have my students do that anyway. Throughout a unit, I want them using formative assessment along the way. What EdTPA asks you to do is to take an assessment tool and see how your students be able to analyze what happened with that. And they ask you to choose 3 students, such as a case study. And how did those students do, and what would you do next? So to answer your question, try to alleviate some of the stress of EdTPA having to drive our curriculum, no, but it would help if your students have practiced the language tools. But it in no way has changed what I do in my classroom. However, my intro to middle grade class, when I'm talking about young adolescent characteristics, I can use the physical, the social, the emotional, the intellectual, the moral, and 2 of those, or that's one of them, but then there's all these personal assets, which is, what do you know about your students? And what are they interested in? Because we know that if we know what our students are interested in and we guide, that helps guide our decisions of how we're teaching information, that personal interest is considered an asset. The intellectual assets are, well, what are their learning styles? You know, are they more visual or kinesthetic learners, that sort of thing. Their community assets are, what are they involved in the school or in their community? Do they play sports out there? Are they in the band? Do they go to the YMCA, you know, after school, those kind of things. And then the cultural assets, like what do you do in your family that's really personal about your culture and your family? And so they're looking at those kinds of things. So that is kind of like a big picture overview. Any other or any questions with that? so that if your arts and science people know what's being taught and how it's being taught and what students are going to have to do with this information, it's really going to help them guide their students. So say, you know, when you're going to be working with students, you want to be able to plan interactive lessons. And so if we're doing language activities and we want students to engage in readers' theater or something, this is something that can really get students involved and motivated. The other piece that I've been missing all along is that I've never had my students justify what they are doing based on either research or theory. Now, in the past, I've had my students have to do research, so they have to go find an article that says how technology impacts student learning, or how cooperative learning, as a research, as a study, who does that kind of thing. And so now I'm having to be more intentional about that, but I don't think that's a bad thing. Then the other question having to do with our partners, if you have any partners who are national board certified out there in your schools, so your teachers who are national board certified, some people have described EdTPA as a little mini national board certified practice tool. And so it's a tool because in national boards you have to write what you're doing, you have to reflect on what you're doing, you have to videotape what you're doing and say what's happening in there, and you have to analyze student learning. And so if you look at EdTPA as something that can prepare people for professionals that down the road they want to go for national board certification, this is at least an awareness of what that is. And all our cooperating teachers who are national board people have said the same thing. Oh, well, this is like national board. We can do this. The other thing with the videos, have any of you had your students videotape themselves teaching? And so you have to sit there for the hour and a half with them if you're going to. What happens in EdTPA, they have to choose a 10-minute clip. And they can't cut and paste. I mean, they can cut 2 clips out to make 10 minutes, but you don't put your little transition slides and, all that. It has to be, and that sort of thing. And really, if you are looking for your rapport and respect of students, if you're looking for engagement, and if you're looking for deeper thinking in the classroom, then a candidate really has to think about, well, what lesson in this 10 days may be showing this? And my students, I only have to teach 3 days. I have them tape all 3 days so that they find that magic, And then they're really looking at themselves, and they choose a 10-minute clip, which is really evidence that they are thinking about, well, what is happening in my classroom? That makes sense? So those are a couple of burning questions. Any other burning questions coming in before? So let's talk about it a little. Okay, so here we go. It is a national portfolio assessment tool. It is specifically for pre-service teachers. We get that. And in North Carolina, and when I've taught in South Carolina and in Georgia, for the most part, we as professors have kind of had our own autonomy about what our students illustrate as far as their performance of planning, teaching, and assessment is concerned. So what has happened is that I can't compare my students and what they're doing with your students, Laura, and what they're doing, right? We can talk about what we've done, but if we don't have a common assessment, we don't really know if what we're doing is perhaps the best that could be being done. And some teachers have a problem with that. I know in North Carolina, some of the responses of the professors were, I don't want someone telling me what to do. We like what we do. We're happy. We worked really hard on this to get it how we want it. And I know in Asheville, we went through revisioning in 2008, I think it was, and people were very tied to, well, what I did in 2008 is good, and I know how to use that tool. And to me, I appreciate that. I appreciate people's hard work and what they do. But I think that if you begin to look at the EdTPA rubrics, you will find that what you are doing is what is being done. And what this could do is streamline what you are doing, or it may be on top of what you're doing, which is what you really don't want to do, if you can help it. Hopefully this could enhance what you are doing, but it allows us to have a common language. And so when we come together at the table, just like with NCAPE, just like with CAPE, like we were talking a little while ago, it's like, these are the issues that my students struggle with on this assessment tool. And if this assessment tool, that in theory is valid and reliable, which there is some question about whether it is valid and reliable as it comes along, as far as that goes. If it is valid and reliable, then perhaps our candidates have a right to be able to see how they compare to whatever the standard is. Different states have different standards. And in different states, some states say that you do not have to pass EdTPA, but some states haven't really decided what passing EdTPA is. And I know that, I believe anyway, in Georgia that you're having to send them off to be scored, an outside score. Because in North Carolina, we have the option to do local scoring. But it isn't state mandated yet. I'm sure once it gets there, it will be there. So a big question about that is the financial commitment that's coming to our students and what that looks like. I know what we have asked is if students' technology monies that are part of their tuition can be used to help offset that cost. Just to kind of throw it. I mean, it is out there. They do take it on.
Holly, was our local scoring for the pilot?
It was.
But now we switched to...
And we'll do local scoring again this year, and we'll send off the sample. We received vouchers from the state this year because they're trying to determine the pass score. So we're getting to send off a certain amount, 49 actually.
So will you have local scoring and Pearson scoring of the same portfolios?
We will.
Oh, nice.
Well, that's what we're planning to do. So we are.
And you're doing the same thing? Because the local scorings they're on a scale of 1 to 3. And the Pearson scoring is on a scale of 1 to 5. And so that's...
And hopefully we can see how calibrated we are.
Yeah, I think that's a good... All right. So there are 3 tasks, and this is what we do in our teaching. One of the things that we didn't do very often at UNCA, and we still don't, is that whole, the instruct piece. Like, we will go out and watch all our teachers teach and give you feedback if you're a pre-service teacher, right? But now having the video component there, it brings it to a new level where a student can actually see themselves, what they look like. And I know when I would watch myself, it's awful there. So, but it's also telling, very telling. So what I wanted to share with you also, though, is that how does EdTPA fit with the Association of Middle Level Education Standards and what happens there? So over on the right where it says the context for learning, that's where the students are saying, who are the students in my classroom? What am I teaching? What book am I using? How many IEPs? What are the different characteristics of students that happen in there? There's a lot of justification in EdTPA that has not been in my professional practice of asking students other than, are you using Bloom's taxonomy somewhere? Can you highlight what that is? Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm doing my age there. I guess I should use Marzano now, though, shouldn't I? There it is, right. So middle level curriculum and assessment, the whole notion of integration in the middle school ones, they do want to know that students know what interdisciplinary or integrated learning is. And so it's not going to be enough just to have what may have been a unit plan that was just about math. There has to be some kind of connection. And I know in North Carolina, our unit plan had to have some global connection to it. I mean, that was something our state tells us we have to have. So we've added that. It's just folded into their unit planning. And while EdTPA is not real interested in global connections, You know, they are interested in the integration. So if it's literacy and history, or if it's science and scientists and technology integration, those kinds of things that can happen with it. Your planning is on your middle level teaching fields, and so if you're a middle level person with language arts as your concentration, that's your content field that you're looking at as far as that's concerned. Middle level instruction is 2 and 3. Family and community involvement. I didn't see a lot of that in EdTPA. It's not really asking you to do that in EdTPA, although I think it is something that we have to do as middle level educators as far as that. It does not have to be in this product that students create in there. But I put sometimes the real life applications can be added to that one there. And then your own professional roles is all over that, because you reflect before you plan, you reflect before and after you teach, and you reflect before and after you assess your student learning. And so it is more about what are you doing as a teacher and how's that do. So it's a tool. And our state standards, we have to have a unit plan. We have to do something with impact on student learning, and we have to show professional development. And is that true in Georgia as well? You have state standards that you have to illustrate those kinds of things. So at EdTPA, and we have to have certain evidences for the State Department that say we are meeting these knowledge, skills, and dispositions. And so we're able to use EdTPA for 2 of those, really, the unit planning and the impact on student learning were quite clearly what would happen. If you took the professional development plan to another step, you could probably use it there, but really it speaks to planning and assessing student learning. So we can use EdTPA as 2 of our state evidences. And there we had to get permission.
Your local scores.
We sure can. Yeah, because it's not mandated yet.
Right.
And what they're saying now also is that, no, I'm sorry, that's Praxis 2. There's so many exams. Do y'all have to do Praxis 2? Yeah, that illustrates our students' depth of content, which I think is more breadth of content, but yeah, I use that. There it is. So here are some tools, and I have them, I call this, you know what foldables are? These are flippables. No, these are sticky notables. I think it's what, stickables. I forget what I was saying. My students were like, you should, yeah, I just have to figure out what it is. So I have some little stickables for you on here, and what we've done with this are the different elements that can come in with EdTPA. And on the other page sheet that I have stapled, behind this, there are some tools that I have, and then I have the printout of the PowerPoint on there, and I'm happy to email the PowerPoint to you. So the first one, when we're talking about developmental assets, has to do with students. And so in your first, if it were a quadrant, the first under students, which is your top right, stickable, is that when they're talking about who your students are, I look at things in 4 quadrants of these students. Their personal, their intellectual, their cultural, and their community assets. And one of the ways to find that information out is to use an interest inventory. And so what I did with my students, with this interest inventory that's behind your first page of stickables, or on the back of your stickable page, the complete back of it, is that you set these things up according to students' personal, intellectual, cultural, or community ideas. And so what I did with my students, it was one of our beginning to get to know you tools. And then, so first, I didn't talk about their intellectual, personal, cultural, and community assets first. Let's see if we've got that on this next slide. What I talked to them about was a getting to know you activity. And so very often when we're talking about building relationships or rocking with relationships, you've got to find out what they're interested in. And this was an activity that students were allowed to move around. And then I had them analyze their teams. So I have my students sit in team, math, science, social studies, English, art, PE, whatever it is your team is. And then they had to figure out who they were as a team based on these characteristics. personal, intellectual, community, and cultural. Before I talk about that's why it's important you need to know who your teammates are, as well as to know who your kids are. And then we talk about, well, how can I take this into my classroom and use it as an instructional strategy for my kids to do. So that's kind of a fun piece. So in that first one, you could look for, I mean, you can change these if you want to add different elements there. So it's not that, I mean, I did interest inventories with my students, and for the most part, it was about personal and intellectual. I didn't do a lot about community and cultural when I did this in my past, but wow, isn't it a great idea to know who does what in their school? So you know you have Eagle Scouts or Boy Scouts that want to be, you know, or maybe they go hiking with their family, or maybe they're of a culture that you didn't even know. Based on what the kids look like, you might not know what kind of culture they come from and what's important to them, because if we know what's important to our students and we can make a personal connection with them, then it's going to help us in our classroom. So that was one of the differences. Does that sound any different than what you would have normally done? No, but it kind of adds another layer, if you will, or another way to consider what's happening in your classroom. So I kind of like that one.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
If you don't want to answer it, like it doesn't fit, that's fine, but
Mhm.
do you think, could you give an example of what students are supposed to write that says how they're using cultural or community assets in the room? Like, what are they supposed to say?
Okay, so if I'm doing a unit that has to do with geometry, okay, and in my geometry, I'm going to have to find out polygons and how to use surface area and volume of something that I may want to do with my life. And so I say to my students, you have to go interview this community or is this cultural?
Either one.
Okay, you need to interview two people who have a job and how they use math in their job, and talk to them about what they do in their job. Because if my thoughts here are that college and career readiness, or thinking about what are you going to do with your life at some point, or thinking about goal setting, or thinking about the connection, it's so hard sometimes to people to think about the connection between math and real life, even though without it, you wouldn't be here on time. But that's beside the point. It is the idea that they begin to say, okay, what does that look like? And so we have a Greek festival, you know, that comes into Asheville, maybe this weekend maybe. And so you say, when you go to the Greek festival, and you're Greek, all right, I want you to see what kind of geometric shapes you see at this Greek festival, and how do you see geometry in that realm, or in your culture? How is geometry in your culture? And they'll say, oh, well, you know, they make these little desserts that are in the shapes of triangles, and I know they had to start out with a square, and they had to roll it, flip them over, and those kinds of things. Could be a way that you could use it. If you're in a language arts classroom and you're going to be studying heroes, then you say, I want you to choose a culture, and it may be your culture, but I also want you to choose another culture, and if it's in our classroom, even better. And I want you to find heroes from both of those cultures. And what were those heroes' characteristics? And so knowing what the cultural aspects are can help you in that sense. So if we're going to the science and we're talking about wellness, or we're talking about health, you may say to students, what are the different kinds of exercises, you know, or what kind of physical activities are very common in your culture, you know, of your family. And some of them may say, well, we always go to Ocala to Highlight, and we play Highlight in the backyard. Well, that's kind of a cultural thing if you're in South Florida, or mid part of Florida, as far as that's concerned. So where's that health and wellness, and how do people respond to that? And why is that important?
Well, do you mind if I?
Nope, come on.
Oh, sorry, I don't want to.
No, we're good. That's why we're here.
Okay, so, listen, if we were teaching a health and wellness lesson about nutrition in rural Georgia, where what we're teaching may not it's not gonna resonate, but, so if we talk about cultural and nutritional practices, and we talk about heavy salt and butter and fried, what does
What do we do?
EdTPA wanna read on the, like, how are we supposed to put these pieces together?
All right, so you might, okay, so it's wellness, and we have identified a concern in our community. The concern in our community is that we have a high percentage of heart problems in our community that are being attributed to wellness. And one of the things we want to talk about with our students is to monitor your own wellness, you know, and to learn how to navigate that you cannot go to your, this is in your classroom, you cannot go to your mom and say, we need to quit eating, you know, fried chicken and potatoes every meal. That there are navigational filters, but knowing how to take care of yourself is something that we see as a community problem. And so one of the things we're going to do in our community is try to communicate our concerns with the community. And so maybe one of the things your students are going to do is to find a community issue that you're concerned about, research it, and produce some posters of, did you know that if you use a lot of salt, these kinds of things, which I think right now the research out is that's not true. And that actually so happy. So in your, you can have it in the first part of the narrative, just like you would have an overview of your lesson. This lesson has to do with health and wellness, and we have identified as a concern in our community, people not walking enough. You know, and we're banking that on Michelle Obama's, you know, concern of a nation that we want to be in support of our government's initiatives, and this is one of them. Is that
Okay.
so? It can just be like a paragraph, but then that whole wellness thing runs through, and so maybe you're doing heart testing where you test your pulse, you know, or you monitor your, you know, your intake for a week of something, or you try to not do something for the week, and how does that make you feel? And so that could be part of your lesson, could be part of your warm-up. I mean, I think that would be, you know, and it's still staying on objectives, but it's bringing the thread. And so if the language function is to compare and contrast, which could be, you know, your critical thinking skill, what is the skill you're wanting to teach, what is the literacy skill you're wanting to teach your student, compare and contrast. We're going to compare and contrast every week. Well, let's look at rural Georgia to inner city Atlanta, and what's the health risks with those students they are comparing